Welcome, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to ODI and to this event on what drives the use of evidence in government. Thank you very much for coming. Welcome also to our online audience. There are maybe some stragglers, but I think it's probably worth getting going. So my name's Louise Shaxson. I'm a Senior Research Fellow in the RAPID programme here at ODI. And the team I work in focuses on how to improve the use of rigorous evidence in policy and practice. And we work with a wide range of organisations, from national governments to civil society organisations, to donors, bilateral donors, multilateral donors, and philanthropists. And we're particularly interested in understanding what drives the use of evidence within government and how we can use that understanding to implement and improve an evidence-informed approach to policy making. Before I go any further, a bit of housekeeping. Could you possibly put your mobile phones on silent, please? But that doesn't mean you can't tweet. Please do tweet extensively. The hashtag is up on the screen, evidence2policy. Our Twitter handles are up on the screen as well. We have got quite a significant online audience. As I said, welcome to them. So the online audience, please do send through any questions that you might have, and they will appear on my iPad, and I'll feed those into the Q&A session as we go along. So, as I said, we've been working on this issue of evidence-informed policy making for about 13 years in the RAPID programme, and there's an increasing degree of interest in the issue in general. But while a lot of work has been done to improve the supply of robust evidence, and an increasing amount of work is being done on how to mobilise the evidence and broker and communicate it into the policy process, relatively little attention has been paid to the political and organisational challenges of embedding a broad culture of evidence within government departments. So that's what we're hoping to explore at tonight's event, and I'm delighted to have a lineup of speakers from across the globe to help us do that. So I'd like to introduce the panel. On my right is His Excellency Dr. Rizal Sukma, who is the Indonesian ambassador to the UK and Ireland. Prior to taking up this position, which I believe was earlier this year. Yes, earlier this year. He was the executive director of the Centre for Strategic and International Studies in Jakarta and a member of the board of advisors for the Institute for Peace and Democracy. And he's worked very extensively on many Southeast Asian issues, including defence and foreign policy, domestic political changes in Indonesia, military reform, Islam and politics. And he served as a member of many high-level committees and was named as one of the 100 global thinkers in 2009 by Foreign Policy magazine. So we're very delighted that Dr. Sukma could be here. Next, I'd like to welcome on Skype Dr. Ian Goldman, who's the head of evaluation and research at the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation in the Presidency in South Africa. And Ian's worked for 38 years on issues of rural development, decentralisation, sustainable livelihoods, well, across the board, really. There's not much that Ian hasn't worked on. And he's worked with national, provincial and local government, as well as with non-government organisations and also in small and medium-sized enterprises. And he's currently a Deputy Director General in DPME, Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation. And he's leading the establishment of South Africa's national evaluation system. So we look forward to hearing about that. To my left is Justin Parkhurst, who is an Associate Professor of Global Health Policy at the London School of Economics and Political Science. And his current work looks at the politics and governance of evidence. And he's just produced this rather wonderful and even better open access book called The Politics of Evidence, From Evidence-Based Policy to the Good Governance of Evidence. And I highly recommend that to everybody. And as I said, it is open access. There are flyers outside for it, and I believe on the pieces of paper that you've got on your seats, there is a link to it. And then at the end is Penny Hawkins, Dr. Penny Hawkins, who is an evaluation specialist with extensive experience in public policy and international development evaluation, and the former head of evaluation at the UK's Department of International Development. But she's held a number of leadership roles in the evaluation arena with many different organisations, including the Rockefeller Foundation, New Zealand Aid, and at the Ministry of Social Development, New Zealand. And she's a past president and fellow of the Australasian Evaluation Society. and has a persistent optimism that evaluation contributes positively to world development and human well-being, which I think we can all probably buy into. So I'm delighted to welcome the panel. In terms of the format of the event, this is a slightly wobbly table. I'll try not to lean on it. I will ask Dr. Sukma to give a keynote presentation. I will then be putting some questions to the panellists. We've worked up some questions to help draw the panellists' particular experience out in response to Dr. Sukma's keynote. And then we will move into a Q&A session with the audience. So we'll go from a keynote to a session with the panellists and then move into a Q&A session with the audience. And I will be feeding in, as I said, questions from the online audience as well. So, Dr. Sukma, could I ask you to, whichever you would prefer.
Just
that's absolutely fine.
So remind me of my think tanks time. Good evening. Thank you so much, Louise. Of course, I'm quite delighted to be here tonight, to share experience. But before I make a very brief remarks on the topic, I would like to remind you that even though I crossed to the dark side, in February this year, the government is often described as the dark side. When you were, it's basically on the bright side, of the research and so on, because you think that the government is always wrong when they try to, formulate policies, and then, we on the research side, always come up with great suggestions. I work for CSIS, and CSIS is a bit different, from other or many academic research institutes, because it's a think tank. So it's basically over the 25 years of my career in the research world, actually, I went back and forth. It's basically, from the policy side, to the research side, policy side, research side, because, we are in the middle. So unlike the university, it's really, on the research and academic side, but think tanks is basically, at least in the Indonesian experience, somewhere in the middle. So, within that context, we learn a great deal about the both sides, of this world. And second, I think how the government use evidence-based, policy research, in the policy making, also depend on, of course, the issue, the policy issues, at hand, because if you look at, for example, defense, foreign policy, to like, other social policy, health policies, probably the government would react, differently, and also would look at the issue, in a different perspective. But I think from the experience that I had, both in the academic world and also within the government, the system within which you work, I think matters a lot. Whether you are in an authoritarian state or you are in a democratic state, I think the way the government work with the research world, the way the government use the research is actually, I think, quite different. Because when I started, my career as a researcher at the CSIS, Indonesia was an authoritarian state, and only later on, 98. After I came back from the LSE, by the way, we from the same university, and then we became a democracy, and then we begin also to open up more, in order to take the research, into the policy making. So I think, but either whether you are the authoritarian state or democratic state, I think knowledge or information is crucial, to policy making. But in a democracy, it's a bit difficult, it's more complicated, because in addition to information, knowledge, you also need that policy that you're formulating is also legitimate. And here requires, a lot of measures that need to be taken. For example, of course, you need a greater understanding about the impact of, certain policy that you are going to execute, on, the public at large. You need, to have a public consultations. You need also, to tell the public, about what you are intending to do. So it's basically, you need to have this policy debate. But that policy debate really the one that open up, more opportunities, for research world, to actually fit into the policy making, process. Because within the authoritarian state, the government basically, can choose, who they want to work with. And then usually they work with those, research institutes that they believe, will enhance, their, power, positions, or those, who can actually also work with them, in order to twist, the result, of a certain, research as well. We Indonesia has been into, in two worlds, if you like, on the authoritarian world and also on democratic world. So when we become a democracy, we actually observe, more and more opportunities, for fitting in the government policy making process, with research-based, and evidence. But the question is really to what extent that those, who are actually in charge of policy making really believe, in the inputs, from, the public, and also the importance of public consultation. This is very true for post-authoritarian, state, because, still, have this hangover, with these, easy things, because they just decide whatever they want, and then if, certain policy went wrong, they can always, correct it, later on without any, consequences, nobody complain, and so on. So this is still, one of the key questions that, we face, even though we move, toward democracy, which is, to what extent that the policymakers really believe that the evidence-based policy input is still a necessary and important part, of the policy making, as a whole. That brings me to the questions of the, I think, put forward by Luis, early on, regarding, when and how government basically use, evidence-based, research. Now, I think depend on a lot of, factors. The most important one is actually who provide those, evidence-based research. What is the quality of those, research or inputs? Whether the institutions that, provides that policy inputs is actually an independent one or not. Whether it has, political agenda, whether it has, certain affiliation with, certain political groups. So I think, in countries like Indonesia, it matters, because we have, so many players, in our domestic, domestic politics. And within that context, I believe that there is still this very huge gap or disconnect, if you like, between the policymakers on the one hand and the research, world, on the other, because a lot of policymakers still believe that they do more because they've been doing this, for a long time, and then they feel that because they are dealing with the concrete problems that the people face on daily basis, then, they think that the research world is actually somewhere, somebody living in the ivory tower, who doesn't really understand, the challenge of day-to-day problems, of policy making. So that disconnect, between the research world, and the policy making world, I think is quite evident, especially, if that particular country just, move toward, democracy. And the second disconnect, I think, I'm sorry that I have to say this, a lot of people, within the government, still prefer to listen to foreign advices rather than the advices, from their own, researchers. We can discuss why, later on. Not necessarily that, the foreign consultant is cleverer or, brighter or smarter, than the local ones, but there are certain, political structures or certain political, I think, factors that they, need to take, into account. On the other hand, the research world, often lives in a la-la world. It's basically live in a very ideal world, and they do have, lack of resources, irrelevant, and then they face, this quality problem, lack of understanding of the policy world, and their independence is basically, suspect, and also, they cannot get out of this debate between normative and, realist, kind of perspective, in policy making. So I can give you one example in foreign policy, for example, in Indonesia, at least, or within many ASEAN countries. A lot of those, who believe that human right is, paramount. So because of that, we need to expel Burma. We need to, kick Myanmar out of the ASEAN, because that run contrary to the norms that we all, believe in, which is, respect for human rights. In terms of normative, policy prescription, probably correct, but you can't do it, in terms of the realistic calculations, of cost and benefit of such, policy options. The second, I think, factor is also the political calculations of those, in powers, of those, who are in charge of the policy making. The policy makers tend to take into account many factors, but good results are obvious. Everybody wants, whether they, they are in the authoritarian state or in a democracy, they all want to have, good outcomes of certain policies. But also, they are concerned. This is true over, especially, in a democracy. How that policy or how those, policy inputs affect the image, because they have election to think about. And that, I think, at least in my experience, is always pop up, whenever, we discuss, certain policy options, how that is going to affect the, image, of the government as a whole, and then how that, will affect, the standing of the government, in the election. Not to mention, of course, there are always elite oppositions and also vested interests that we need to take into account within a certain political structure. And finally, within that political calculation, I think we face a very serious problem in weighing this impact of a certain policies between the short term, which might be bad impact of certain policy, and the long term good impact of certain policies. I'll give you an example. Trade liberalizations. So it's basically over long term. The evidence, in all the studies, suggests that you open up, your economy, and then you liberalize more, and then usually, your economy, will become, I think, will grow, better. But there are pains that you need to deal with, within the short-term, periods. So it's very difficult, to tell somebody you should not eat for the next 3 days because on the 4th day I'll take you to the best restaurant in town. So it's very difficult to convince the people, in that sort of the dilemma that we face, between the short-term, bad implication of good long-term policies. So how you basically address that particular dilemma is a real policy issues, in itself. So when the research is actually used, very easy to determine for many government. Number one, when the government is sure that that policy suggestion is safe, to implement. Safe in the sense that nobody, no research institutes, no think tanks that propose that particular policy option would brag about it later on. When the government say, really believe that a certain policy option is good because it's based on, clear and analysis based on evidence, then when they implement it, if the institutes or the center, or a think tank that propose that a policy suddenly brag, the government is implementing my suggestion, then usually you have a problem. And usually many government actually refrain themselves from not actually implementing good policies simply because of the fear that the certain NGOs or certain think tanks that propose it, or research institute that propose it, take the credit or claim that the policy is actually come from them. The think tank in that sense, we are very good in shutting our mouth, in terms of which suggestions, which policy option, which research that actually are crucial in certain policies. But unless you can make sure that you're not going to brag about, then the government feels safe. Then usually they will take up the research that you give to them. The second regulatory framework is also important. I think those who work in this knowledge sector initiative in Indonesia really understand because the regulatory framework actually can hamper the use of evidence-based policy research. I'll give you an example. Especially in terms of, say, a research institute is asked to do a major study to assess the impact of a certain policy, and then usually they have these regulations that unless your research institute has this, is registered as a company or either consultancy company, then you're not allowed to enter this bidding for government project. Second, for fear of being accused of internal procurement, state university cannot also do or take that particular research. So you need to also address that problem. And finally, the networking with the government officials is very important. Do not expect that no matter how good is your policy research, then you think that they will immediately grab it and then use it as the basis for policy making. But you need to do advocacy with them. You need also to work with them and discuss it. That require really deep and strong network that probably dated back years before you come up with the this policy policy advocacy that you are doing. So I think that is also critical. If they don't know you, then do not expect that they will take your study. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was, I thought, absolutely fascinating and a very rich set of issues that I hope we can draw on. Ian, I'd like to turn to you now, if I may. The thing that I particularly picked up on was Dr. Sukma's point, or his question, to what extent do policymakers believe that evidence inputs are necessary? And in terms of building a commitment to evidence, could you talk to us about your experience in South Africa?
So I think, can you hear me all right? So as Dr. Sumka said, I think the relationship issue is critical. In our case, we are like an internal government knowledge broker who both commission evaluations, run the evaluation system, and then try and interpret, do the cabinet memos, etc., which are taken to cabinet, etc. So we're playing this brokering role. So we've had to develop the credibility of the system, which are, as Dr. Sumka was saying, was things like the independence, the credibility of the work, and our own credibility as an institution in the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation. And then we've also been working on trying to build evidence champions in senior managers. So we worked on the supply side, but we've also been working on the demand side, because we know that if senior managers are reluctant, we're not going to win the battle. And the dominant culture in government is very much a compliance culture. And so to try and build a culture where managers are prepared to look at their failures and how they can improve things is quite something. So one of the things we've done is around running courses for the top 3 levels of the public service to try and show why evidence is important. And we've now trained about 220 members, including 10 permanent secretaries, directors general, and a lot of deputy director generals and chief directors. So those are the top 3 levels. We tried to create a course which is quite compelling, experiential, very high quality speakers, punchy, that people would really enjoy and want to come to. And it's building up a bit of a cachet now. And we're seeing results from that. And so, for example, some departments that were reluctant, for example, the Director General of Justice came with 6 of her management team. We now have a very important evaluation of the integrated justice system happening. We had a Deputy Director General from Treasury come. She went back and reported how important the course was. We now have one of the Treasury's programs that we're evaluating, and they're supporting us on funding evaluations, some of which are quite expensive and need substantive inputs. So we're seeing this as an important contributor. It's not going to solve the problems, but it's helping to build that culture where people see the importance. And we're definitely seeing that, for example, even in senior management meetings of directors general now, you'll see words like theories of change being used. The word evaluation has become quite common now. So there's much more of an understanding of why this is important. That doesn't mean we still have quite a lot of fear from some departments, which are fearful of what evaluations might show. But it's, this is a 20-year battle.
And is there something that you could comment on about Dr. Sukma's comment that possibly researchers are too normative? Do you find that's a problem with some of the evaluations that you commission?
When you say normative, in what sense?
I think, Dr. Sukma, you were referring to being based on value systems that don't necessarily coincide with those expressed in the government.
Yeah, so I mean, there is an issue there, and we do have to work very closely with evaluations to try and make sure that they deliver value and really address the questions that we want to ask. And so we don't have a hands-off approach to the evaluations, although they are outsourced. The steering committee plays a very hands-on role right through the process. There are problems. You sometimes find, in some sectors, you've got well-known people who've got well-known positions in the sector, and so they're coming with an agenda when they come, and that has to be managed as part of the process.
Great, thank you very much. Dr. Hawkins, could I turn to you to ask about your experiences of embedding a culture of evaluation in different types of department?
Yeah, and I think the different types is probably a key point, because it's different in every single organisation I've worked in. So it depends on how the organisation operates, what the people, how they think and how they value. So really the culture of the organisation is paramount really in moderating the success of trying to embed evaluation and associated activities within an organisation. So can't really stress that more. So I think in my experience over I think I've been playing this game for 25 years now, I can't believe it. The pendulum seems to swing across governments and also within organisations from enthusiastic commitment, where you have top-level people who can see the value of this and support it and divert resources towards it, to the opposite end of the arc of the pendulum, where there is fear, as Ian pointed out, can happen, and really strong resistance to evaluation. And then what we see is the resources are diverted away, and evaluation becomes marginalised, and evidence isn't such a large part of decision making. So in those sorts of situations, it depends on where the pendulum is according to your starting point within an organisation and what can be done. But what I've found is that relevance is a key thing. So evaluations have to answer the questions that are relevant to policymakers and programme managers, because that's only when that happens is the information and the evidence produced going to be used. So, and I think we really all know that. But also it has to relate to other types of functions. So how does a particular organisation pick up information, think about it, learn from it, use it? That differs across organisations. The monitoring systems that exist in organisations. So evidence and robust, rigorous evidence is one thing, but then all the other types of information that's being produced by an organisation is another. And which of all these different information sources are chosen at the point of decision making really depends on that information landscape across the organisation, and indeed the information systems that support that. So having a good connection, and if you like an integrated or strategic level system that connects all these dots between these different types of information. And the benefits need to be seen. So actually demonstrating, having a good kind of portfolio of examples of where evidence has been used successfully, where evaluations have been relevant and useful to those that have posed the questions and demanded the evaluations. But the other side of it, that's all internal to the organisation. The other side of it, which I've seen in some but not all organisations, is the reputational aspects to this externally. So if an organisation holds itself up as being good at producing and using information, does that then accrue reputational credit, if you like, external to the organisation with people that count to that particular organisation? And that's something to do with good communication, both internally and externally. So there's a few things to be going on with, but you've probably got other questions.
Well, does this issue of reputational credit, does that get to what Dr. Sukma was saying about legitimacy, about the importance of government departments being able to demonstrate to the public that their legitimacy?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly. I mean, that again is going to vary in different situations. And of course we can't ignore the big P and small p politics. Yeah. So in different, I've also seen this in different countries. The role and function of evidence within policy making. Yes, I mean I think I agree with the point point that you made there. That's certainly been my experience.
And Ian, is legitimacy an issue that you've come across when you, for example, when you've presented evaluations in cabinet, when you've done sort of tricky evaluations with government departments? What's your view on the importance of the legitimacy issue?
Yeah, legitimacy is an issue. It's not so much an issue when we go to cabinet because we're presenting it, so we are seen as legitimate. But for the actual departments where evaluations are being done, it is important, and that the people are seen as credible. They're seen as on the right side of politics. They're seen as pro transformation agenda, etc. It's important, and obviously, if they're seen as a credible experts in their own right. So there is a particular issue in South Africa, of course, because of the heritage of apartheid too. So there are issues about a grey white male like me who has particular connotations versus a dynamic, bright young black person who's seen as credible politically.
So that was my next question, is how do you make sure that you bring in the viewpoints that challenge, that you don't just sort of get stuck in a particular viewpoint?
Well, I mean, there is always an issue of viewpoints, and I mean, I think I think one of the messages that we have to give, I mean, one of the dangers with consultants, whether they're academics or not, is sometimes they can give you what they think you want to hear, because they don't want to prejudice losing the contracts. And so one of the things we have to do is to say, in fact, Cabinet has said very clearly to us, we want to know the unvarnished truth. And they really want to hear what the story is. So we have to push them, and sometimes we have to push the consultants to be more explicit, more clearer, more robust in what they're saying, etc.
Dr. Sukma, as you're sitting here nodding, is that your experience as well?
Yeah, it's for sure, because, I think Ian's position is a bit different, from, say, research in general, because, he's also inside, presenting, all those, policies and policy studies, to the cabinet. That's usually, a less as a problem, that we face. If you are inside and then you present it, and then because you're already, part of that group. But if you are outside, struggling, to try to tell the government or the policymakers that, your research is good, and also it's evidence-based, that if you take, say, course A, then this would happen because of, say, examples in, country A, country B, country C, then, if you don't have that, I think, trust, or, you are not seen, as, say, somebody who's independent, it takes a long time, before you can convince, the government that your study is really evidence-based. It's not, actually, geared, to achieve a certain, ideological outcome. So that's, I think it's quite common, in the government's, our policy making, process.
And I think this issue of trust is very important. I mean, certainly I've been working on a project with Ian in South Africa for the past 2 years. And we operated under a very, very strong memorandum of understanding that we would not publish anything at all. We wouldn't even tweet, we wouldn't blog, we wouldn't do anything until the government department was absolutely happy with what we had written. Which caused the donors some problems because they because they wanted us to
put it on a website.
Yeah, they wanted us to put it on a website exactly, and we had to tell them no. These were, and so we would send them confidential draft documents, but there was nothing. And if I could just make a little plug, there's a couple of there's three publications from the work in South Africa. But I think this question of trust is important. Penny, before we come to Justin, I will come to Justin to wrap all of this up. But Penny, can I just ask you, having worked in DFID and in donors, and you know how much they like impact, you know how much they want evidence of, from evaluations, but how does that relate to this issue of trust? And the point that Dr. Sukma made is that the recommendations are safe when nobody is going to brag about it later on, because sitting in ODI, we want to brag about it, but actually, working with the department in South Africa, they didn't want us to brag about it. And these are co-produced. These are all co-produced documents.
I think there's an important thing here around the bragging is generally about success, right? The bragging isn't about failure.
Yeah.
So there's that. I think I just want to pick up on the irony of what you just said about the South African experience, that the South African government, needed to be happy before you published, and the donor wasn't happy. Yeah. So it would have been quite interesting to see if the focus of the work was on the donor, and whether the donor would have been happy to publish. And because my experience is actually the same pressure on holding back anything that has any kind of negative finding in would be actually the same, in my experience. So if it's a government donor or a partner government, the nervousness is the same. So just pointing out that irony. But I think who takes the credit? I mean, everybody wants to take the credit for a successful policy or a successful intervention. So, I mean, that's kind of how things are. But if I can just, focus again on the failure, that is the most difficult thing. So I can think of a couple of examples in my career where I've been on the verge of resigning because I've had to defend an evaluation report with a government minister who was really upset about it, and really, put pressure on to change the findings, put pressure on to hold back publication. That's where the friction is with evidence and evaluation. It's not generally around the successes. Yeah. So, if I hear from a minister's special advisor who said, "Oh, do we really need evaluation?" So that's a warning bell too, if you work in evaluation. Yeah.
Thank you. Justin, I'd like to turn to you now to wrap all of this up beautifully with a discussion about the good governance of evidence. Perhaps you could explain what you mean by the good governance of evidence and the key aspects of it.
Okay. It probably touches on lots of these things. It's going to be very hard to wrap all of this up. The idea that I proposed in terms of the good governance of evidence was basically to take a step back and kind of let's go back to what you started with when you talked about RAPID. And you talked about its goal, if I wrote it down correctly, how to improve the use of rigorous evidence. And so what I realized in kind of what I've read out there in the field is there's not actually a lot of direct engagement with what we mean by improvement. Right? What is a better use of evidence? What does it mean to use evidence well? There's some very simplistic things we'll see out there where people talk about the uptake of a specific study. We did randomized control trial X, and if that finding gets used, that's good. But there's a very robust literature that says that's very simplistic, and that's not how policy is made. That reduces political decision-making to technical exercises when politics is about priority setting and deciding amongst multiple competing social values. So recognizing the reality of policymaking, what is good use of evidence? The second aspect I also looked at is the fact that a lot of people weren't necessarily thinking about the sustainable long-term improvement. How do you improve the use of evidence in ways that get sustained over the long term? And what I like very much about the work you've done here at ODI and these working papers, which I think are great, if anyone needs another plug for them, is that it's starting to look at what I would call institutionalization. So institutionalization, for me, is about how do you build systems that govern the use of evidence. So I would say institutions govern the use of evidence, and that the structures in place, the rules by which they operate, the norms and the practices within the people working there, those things dictate when evidence is used, which forms of evidence are prioritized, for which decisions. They dictate the role of the public in consultation and deliberation. All of those things are built into how institutions are built. But institutionalization from a political science perspective is a normative process. It's not a technical process. By a normative process, I mean these are value-based decisions to decide when evidence should be used, in whose interests, when the public should be represented. These are values that have to be decided upon. So if institutionalization is a normative process, then we have to think about, and if institutions govern the use of evidence, we have to somehow be more explicit about asking the question, what is the good governance of evidence? What do we see as better or improved uses of evidence? My book draws on two sources. It draws on kind of the evidence-based and evidence-informed policy movement, who are primarily concerned with scientific good practice and scientific fidelity. They're concerned about the misuse of evidence, the obfuscation, spin, creating evidence in ways that would violate scientific good practice to get the results you want. But on the other side, you have the critical authors who argue that you can't just defer to evidence alone for policymaking. And they're making a very different normative argument. They're concerned with democratic representation. The fact that no single piece of evidence talks to all social values. And if you only defer to, say, randomized trials or hierarchies of evidence, you end up biasing your decisions to those things which are conducive to measurement, or where somebody or some agency or some institution decided to spend money to do evaluations. And in healthcare, a classic example is the fact that treatments are very often tested through rigorous randomized mechanisms by the pharmaceutical industry, who have a lot to gain from them, while prevention, public health interventions, smoking cessation or obesity aversion through healthy lifestyles, those things are not really conducive to experimental trials, and there's not a lot of money being spent on them. So if we only focus on randomized trials as a way of influencing policy, we are in fact biasing our attention to those things that serve particular interests. And there are other social values out there. So for me, those were two sets of normative principles that I thought needed to be built into our concepts of good governance. So what does it mean for evidence to be well governed? It has to touch on many of the things which I think the speakers have already talked about. There has to be rigor. It has to be robust. It has to be scientifically valid. But it also has to represent good governance from a democratic perspective. It has to be transparent. It has to represent the values of the public. And it has to be evidence that speaks to the needs of the policy itself, not just evidence that happens to be high quality from a purely technical perspective. I guess the last thing I'd say is that I think, again, Louise, you kind of set out by saying, there's been a lot of work in attempting to provide high quality evidence, and what we're seeing now is this need to build systems which increase it. And there's been a lot of talk about culture of evidence and cultures of evidence and building that. And again, I think if we think about institutionalization, building a culture of evidence use is a very important part of it, but it's only one step. You can think about the people who work in an agency that's making decisions and what their beliefs are. Do they believe that evidence is important? And then the next step up might be their practices. Do they actually act on those beliefs? Do they actually utilize evidence in particular ways? The next step in institutionalization might be norms. Are there norms of practices? Do people expect that others in their group work that way? And then you might have formal rules. And there are lots of examples of rules as well. So the Mexican government, for example, actually legislating that evaluations have to be done of social policy interventions. Or Ontario in Canada, I believe, has legislated now that reviews of evidence have to show transparently where they got the evidence from. So that's actually making rules in place. And then maybe the final one would be building new agencies and structures which have those rules built in. So in the UK, you might think of the What Works Centres or NICE as attempts to build new institutions around particular rules, norms, and practices. So I think it's really excellent to hear, because I think what we're seeing in Indonesia, in South Africa, and elsewhere are steps towards this institutionalization, moving beyond simply calling for more evidence and better evidence, moving beyond calls for hierarchies and randomized trials to guide what we do, to say, wait a minute, what does good evidence look like? How do we build systems that shape how decisions get made in the long term? How do we build systems that improve the use of evidence according to multiple normative concerns like good scientific practice and good democratic practice?
Is it systems or is it networks? Picking up on what Dr. Sukma said earlier about the importance of networks, about the importance of building trust.
Yeah.
I lean towards systems because, on the one hand, trust is important. You were giving the example of having trust, building trust with the South African government, or Dr. Goldman, I think you referred to. I'm trying to remember the exact words, but something about how you have to show that you have to build trust by showing the quality of what you're doing and showing the rigor and the like. And I think that is important. But there's also a risk of trust going down the route of personal connections, right? And we all know of cases where knowledge brokers are good knowledge brokers because they know the minister, right? They went to school with the minister. And for me, that's actually somewhat undemocratic. I'd rather have a system where you didn't have to know the minister. And if you have good, high-quality, policy-relevant evidence, there's a conduit. There's a system by which you can provide that, even if you're not a personal friend. Now, there's a level of trust that has to be built in terms of the rules about what's considered good quality and rigorous evidence. So the independence of the body providing it, I think, was a good example of trust that needs to be built in. Autonomy, arm's length distance, so that you know you're not directly manipulated by the decision makers, perhaps, is a good example of trust. But I steer away from kind of the networking idea, because I worry sometimes, especially with funding incentives from I've seen it from donor bodies or research funders, this idea that you should actually have policy influence. Your research should enact policy change, for me is kind of crossing a line of democratic representation. I, as a researcher, even if I do very policy relevant, I used to do HIV research or maternal health research, it's still not for me to decide what that country does with that research. I'd rather there be a system by which I can provide it, knowing that it will be trusted and knowing that it will be considered, and then the country can make its decisions one way or another.
Thank you. Just a final question to Dr. Sukma before we go into the Q&A is, from your experience with CSIS and with IDP, where do you see this balance lying with trying to create those networks so that you can get the ears of the ministers, and setting up these systems so that you're not just bypassing the democratic process?
In our works, is that the policy advocacy is important. You can't just, produce, say, 200 pages of very good evidence-based policy research, send it to government's ministry, then expect that they will read it. They even take a look at it. They don't. So you need to advocate it. You need to have coffee with them so you can give it to them, and then discuss it. So that process of networking is also crucial. But I agree that in certain in certain circumstances, I think this issue of say lack of distrust, for example, can be rectified by having more open policy debate. So if say government not really sure whether a certain policy suggestion is really good or can be trusted, then they send it out to the public, to have a debate, to be challenged by other research institutions, and so on. So probably this is part of the system that you're talking about. So there should be a mechanism out there outside the government and research institutes that provide evidence-based policy input, to actually expand the discussions in the public. We did that a lot. So when we're not really sure, just send it out. So certain ideas, in certain, say, policy papers has been, sent to the government, and then they will have a debate. But on the other hand, it can also create new problem. So when everybody jump, and try to discuss a certain policy option that nobody knows where it comes from, then the government will have to face the problem of scarcity or plenty. And suddenly, instead of 2 options, you have like 20 options or policy options over there to choose from. Then you'll be in trouble.
Yeah. And Ian, we've talked a lot about evaluation evidence, but perhaps you could say a little bit about the other types of evidence that DPME is collecting and how those are fed into decision processes.
Yeah, can I just say a couple of other points too? Because I think the systems point that Justin's saying is very important. And in fact, we have partners in Uganda and Benin, and we all are setting up national evaluation systems. And it's about having a system that works from government, deciding what they want to do, and generating the evidence in a very purposive way to inform government. But yes, I mean, the other thing I think is, Dr. Sukma is coming from in a sense, you have your research and you've got to sell it. We're trying to work with creating the demand for evidence, and where people are looking for specific research or evaluations. And we're now working, for example, on trying to build evidence maps so that in the key priority areas that we're focusing on, we're building up a picture of what evidence is actually available, and then we can be more purposive about where we need to collect that evidence.
And that's quite a political process, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, well, firstly, there's a question of where, and then the question of what you decide to focus on. And when you look at evidence maps, you've got to decide which outcomes you're going to choose. So that, yes, there are a whole series of selection processes in there. And then there's also, there can be tension. I mean, we are, if you like, our mandate is around evidence, but there's particular sector departments like human settlements that we're working with on one may have a slightly different point of view. So that, this is the tensions you have to manage.
Yeah. Well, I could
just one other point. One other point, though, just this network. I mean, one of my key roles actually is I have to build trust in the directors general that what we're trying to do is not to put the burners under people, but to try and improve the performance of government. And that aspect of trust is really, really important, because if they think I'm just trying to undermine them, they will reject the system out of hand. And so they have to believe that we're really trying to do this just to improve performance and to help them to achieve better.
Thank you. So yeah, I could carry on just with the five of us chatting all night, but I think it's probably time to open it up to questions from the floor. People who are listening online, please do ask questions, because they will come through on the iPad. We haven't had any at the moment. But so I think let's take 3 or 4 questions to begin with, and then we'll have a round of answers and do it like that. So 1, 2, 3. Okay, so if you'd like to start first, yes, if you could wait for the microphone and then say your name and where you're from.
Okay.
And if it's directed to anybody in particular, let us know.